They did not scan her file looking for a threat. They scanned it looking for a clerical error, the kind every intake officer expects to find in a species that had only been filing paperwork for 200 years. What the scanner found instead made the room go quiet in a way that had nothing to do with courtesy. Every human on Earth had a file now. That was the arrangement. 6 months after the Hegemony ship settled into high orbit and announced with total sincerity that humanity would be processed rather than conquered, every government on the planet had complied. Compliance meant biometric scans, employment records, education transcripts, criminal histories. All of it folded into a single administrative document called a compliance ledger. The ledgers were not punishment. The Hegemony was careful to say repeatedly in the tone of an entity explaining something to a child. A species could not be trusted until it could be filed correctly, and until then it would be filed anyway. Carefully, patiently, the way a museum catalogs a specimen whose consent was never part of the process. The ledger forms themselves were a small daily humiliation nobody had bothered to complain about. Field 7 asked for a species' primary contribution to interstellar civilization and offered a drop-down menu with 4 options, the last of which was simply none recorded. Field 11 asked whether the applicant's homeworld had achieved unified planetary governance, and the honest answer, checked in triplicate by every human filing officer that month, was no. Field 14, the one that stung longest in the council chambers, asked for the applicant species' estimated administrative age, and defaulted when no data was supplied to a single word, juvenile. The forms were not designed to insult. That somehow made them worse. An insult required someone to notice you, and the Hegemony's paperwork had not been written with humanity in mind at all. It had been written for whatever species happened to be filed next, and humanity simply happened to be the one currently standing at the counter. The Provisional Council had accepted all of it without objection, because the alternative to filing was never spelled out and nobody wanted to test it. Compliance had become a kind of weather. You did not argue with a form. You filled it out, submitted it, and went back to your actual work, and for most of Earth's 8 billion newly filed citizens, that was the entire extent of first contact. A drop-down menu, a status field, and a smiling face on a broadcast repeating that none of this constituted judgment. Registrar-Prime Ossilith Vantic, a career administrator whose species measured professional seniority in ledgers processed rather than years served, and who had personally processed more human files that quarter than anyone else in the sector, had gone through 11,000 of them that month alone. He was efficient about it. Human records were short, sparse, easy to categorize, and he had developed a genuine fondness for the species the way a filing clerk grows fond of a drawer that never jams. His communications to Earth's Provisional Council were unfailingly polite. This intake process constitutes no judgment of worth, read the standard opening line of every directive, only an accounting of function. He smiled when he said it on the broadcasts, slightly too long, slightly too even, and Earth had gotten used to the sight of an alien face performing a warmth it did not feel. Dr. Amara Osei, Senior Archivist, Cross-Signal Intelligence Division, a title that meant in practice that she filed other people's intercepted radio noise for a living, and had done it for 19 years without a single promotion, came up on his console at 4:12 local Hegemony ship time. Her employment record was unremarkable. Her education was unremarkable. Her personnel file included 2 formal reprimands for unauthorized allocation of departmental server capacity, which Vantic noted with the mild amusement of a man reading about a parking violation. He moved to close the file and generate her function summary, the last field the ledger required. The summary would not generate. The system tried to draw it automatically from her work archive and could not, because the archive did not resolve into a category the Hegemony's software recognized as a legitimate function. Vantic opened it manually, assuming a formatting error. He read the first folder. Then he read it again more slowly. Then he stopped mid-sentence in a conversation with his intake assistant, which she would later describe as the first time in 4 years she had heard him go silent without finishing a thought. Amara didn't know any of this yet. She found out the way most people found out something had gone wrong with the Hegemony. Her file status changed from process to under review, and a notice appeared asking her to remain available for a follow-up interview. She sat in the waiting room of the intake office in Accra for 40 minutes, watching the status field on the wall display cycle through the same 4 words. And when Vantic's translated voice finally came through the console, he did not ask her a single question about her employment history. "Is something wrong?" she asked. There was a pause before he answered, 3 full seconds, which for a species that spoke in complete formal sentences without hesitation was the conversational equivalent of a held breath. "No," he said. "Everything is extremely correct." That was the moment, she would say later, that she got frightened, not the silence. The word he chose, nothing that is fine gets called extremely correct. What Vantic had found, buried in a work archive never flagged, reviewed, or funded by anyone above her pay grade, was 19 years of decrypted hegemony administrative traffic. Not military codes, not weapons data. Shipping manifests, fleet rotation schedules, cargo classifications, the dull, enormous paperwork of an empire that ran on the same bureaucratic instinct it had used to file 11,000 humans that month. And Amara Osei had been quietly reading its diary since before the ships ever arrived. She had started in her 20s, listening to what everyone else in her department called background noise, a faint, repeating signal pattern that had been drifting past Earth's receivers for decades, officially classified as deep space static. Her supervisor at the time told her she was wasting agency bandwidth chasing coincidence and closed the project's funding line that same afternoon. She kept it running anyway, on servers nobody used during off hours, filed under a maintenance label so nobody would ask what it was. Because static didn't repeat in prime-numbered intervals. This did. She never told anyone what she'd reframed it as, not out loud, not in a meeting, not in a report anyone read. She wrote it once in a private notebook beside her monitor. It isn't noise. It's paperwork nobody's supposed to see. 19 years later, that single sentence was the entire thesis of what the review board was now scrambling to verify. Once full clearance came through, her review board called in reinforcements, because 19 years of undocumented decryption work needed more than one signature. Kwame Bonsu, a cryptolinguist who had spent 6 years arguing the pattern showed grammatical recursion, and had been quietly reassigned to weather satellite maintenance for insisting on it in 3 separate department meetings, was the first name on the list. He didn't say anything for almost a minute after he opened the archive. Then he sat down on the floor of the server room because his legs had stopped agreeing to hold him. "This isn't a decrypted signal," he said. "This is their entire logistics language. Cargo class, fleet designation, port assignment, resupply windows. You didn't crack a code. You learned to read their mail." He spent the rest of the night cross-checking grammatical structure against the 6 years of theoretical work his own department had rejected, and found that every rule he'd once been laughed out of a meeting for proposing was correct. Down to the recursive clause markers he'd drawn on a whiteboard someone had eventually erased without asking him. The second discovery took longer, because it required more than one archive to confirm. Priya Ilangavan, a systems analyst once formally warned for filing a report titled "Their supply ships follow a schedule," and it is not a coincidence. A document her division head had rejected as speculative and quietly pulled from the shared drive. Spent 2 days cross-referencing Amara's 19 years of manifests against known hegemony ship movements in Earth's own tracking data. The schedule matched to within 4 hours across 3 separate fleet rotations spanning a decade. Every resupply run, every quiet transfer of correction vessels between systems, had been sitting in plain, dull, bureaucratic text the whole time, waiting for someone bored enough and stubborn enough to actually read it. Priya printed the overlay chart and taped it to the wall instead of saying anything, and let the 4-hour margin of error speak for itself. Nobody in the room needed the number explained twice. The third discovery took 2 more days, and it didn't come from a specialist inside the archive team. It came from a liaison officer attached to Earth's Provisional Defense Council, finally cleared to see what the fuss was about, who found weapon calibration logs folded inside routine maintenance correspondence. The kind of document nobody guards because nobody imagines anyone would want it. Every correction vessel's power signature, shield harmonic, and reload interval cataloged and dated going back 11 years. He read it standing in the doorway and did not sit down at all. He asked quietly whether anyone else in the building understood what they were looking at, and was told that until 4 days earlier nobody had. He spent the following morning drafting a memo recommending the archive be classified above his own clearance level. A recommendation his superiors approved within the hour, which was, by the standards of any defense council on the planet, close to unprecedented speed. By the end of the 4th day, what had started as a single flagged personnel file had become the largest classified project in the provisional government's short history, staffed by a team that had, until that week, been scattered across 3 departments and considered individually mildly difficult to work with. Nobody used that word anymore. The word circulating through the building by then was thorough, spoken the way people speak about something they wish they'd taken seriously years earlier. Vantic's formal directive arrived on the 4th day, addressed not to Amara but to the Provisional Council, written in the unbothered, devastating language of an institution that had been perfecting condescension for 3,000 years. The unauthorized possession of hegemony administrative traffic constitutes a breach of Ledger Compliance Section 9, it read. This correspondence carries no accusation of hostile intent, it carries a requirement. The archive will be surrendered in full within 24 hours, or the intake designation of the responsible party will be revised to non-compliant. and a correction vessel will be dispatched to resolve the discrepancy directly. A footnote, almost an afterthought, specified that non-compliance would also result in the permanent suspension of Earth's provisional filing status. A phrase that meant nothing to most of the council, and everything to the two people in the room who understood what it would do to every treaty signed in the 6 months since first contact. Without a filing status, Earth would not be a species under review. It would be a species with no status at all, a category the hegemony reserved for territory rather than people. And the council understood, reading it, exactly which of those two outcomes Vantic's directive was quietly designed to make attractive by comparison. Amara read it twice. Then she went back to work because acceleration, not fear, was the only response the deadline earned from her. The 24 hours didn't go toward panic. They went toward a plan built entirely out of paperwork. Because paperwork was the one language she had spent 19 years learning to speak better than the people who'd written it. If the correction vessel followed the same maintenance and resupply protocol as every ship in her archive, its approach corridor would be logged the same way, in the same dull format, on the same predictable schedule. She didn't need to stop the ship. She needed to file it somewhere else. The correction vessel entered Earth orbit at 03:0, alone and unescorted. A hegemony doctrine didn't consider a records dispute worth committing a fleet. Its approach followed the exact resupply corridor its own manifest had used 11 times before. Amara's team fed it a substitute cargo designation through the same administrative channel the hegemony used to redirect its own supply traffic, flagging the vessel for decommission inspection at a secondary coordinate 400 kilometers off its intended path. The vessel took 6 minutes to notice the discrepancy in its own paperwork and 11 minutes to correct course. And for those 11 minutes it sat exactly where Earth's provisional defense grid needed it, well within range of 3 ground-based ion arrays, quietly repositioned the night before under cover of a routine maintenance notice of their own. The vessel's shields held for the first 90 seconds, longer than the projections said they would, and its point defense turrets tracked and destroyed 2 of Earth's 12 targeting drones before the array's second volley found it. The liaison officer allowed himself one grim nod of respect for that 90 seconds. Then the volley found the exact seam in the rear plating that 11-year-old calibration logs said would be there, and the ship's weapons array powered down. It didn't explode. It reversed course and withdrew past the lunar debris field, and Earth let it go because the entire point had never been destruction. It had been proof that the paperwork worked both ways now. Total engagement time: 4 minutes 12 seconds. Earth's provisional defense grid recorded 0 casualties and 1 damaged array, back online within the hour, logged in the maintenance record with the same dull administrative language the hegemony itself preferred. Vantic's official directive that followed was short and procedurally cold, filed within the hour, closing the compliance breach without comment. His personal transmission, sent 9 hours later on an unlisted channel, was not. There was a silence at the start of it, long enough that Amara almost ended the call, and when he finally spoke his voice had lost the smiling cadence he used for broadcasts. "I catalogued your species as easy to file," he said. "It was an audacious assumption and it was mine, and I made it because you filed your own history so poorly that I mistook the mess for emptiness. You were never empty, you were unindexed." He didn't apologize for the review notice. He apologized specifically for assuming a species that hadn't yet learned to organize its own past could not have been quietly organizing his. What followed was not a surrender, and not a treaty in the traditional sense. Earth's Provisional Council, at Amara's insistence, did not ask for the archive to be forgotten or for a formal apology entered into any record. They asked for Earth to be listed as a verified archive node, a formal partner in hegemony record-keeping rather than a subject of it, with data-sharing terms attached to every future ledger the hegemony filed on any species, not only their own. It was a smaller ask than a war would have won and a larger one than diplomacy alone could have gotten. And it passed because Vantic, for the first time in the entire intake process, filed a human request as correct without amending a single clause. Amara did not attend the signing ceremony. She was back in the server room by then, 3 days into cross-referencing a new pattern in the correction fleet's revised communications, one that didn't match anything in her existing archive yet, in a dialect that looked deliberately altered from everything that came before it. She made a note of it in the same private file where she'd once written that it wasn't noise, it was paperwork nobody's supposed to see. This time she wrote something shorter. The Provisional Council asked her once whether she wanted a formal title to go with the new arrangement. Director of something, they suggested, Chief Archivist of the Human Record. She declined and kept the same office, the same desk, and the same 19-year-old habit of arriving before anyone else did, because the work had never been about the title. It had been about the 19 years nobody had asked her to justify, finally justified in the space of 4 minutes and 12 seconds, and about the drawer the Hegemony had once assumed would stay easy to file forever. They know I'm reading now, good, let's see what they file next. Let's see what they file next.